This video is one in a series of videos available at ethicsandclimate.org that examine the practical importance of understanding the ethical dimensions of climate change. I am Don Brown, Scholar in Residence, Sustainability Ethics and Law, Widener University School of Law. This particular video will examine what is generally referred to as the climate change disinformation campaign, and in particular why this campaign has been so destructive, is so harmful to the human race, and why perhaps it could be understood, should be talked about as a new kind of crime against humanity. The international scientific community understood the very basic physics of the greenhouse effect by 1860, yet the international community didn't wake up to the enormous threat entailed by climate change until the late 1950s, when an American by the name of Keeling put a CO2 monitoring station on top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. In 1965, President Johnson gave a speech and warned Americans about the enormous threat of climate change based upon the information coming out of Hawaii. At the time that President Johnson gave the speech, CO2 levels in the atmosphere had risen to 320 parts per million. Opposition to climate change really got started to be organized in the early 1980s under the U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who included among his staff several people that came out of the fossil fuel industry and were known to oppose government action on climate change. By the time this opposition got organized in the early 1980s, carbon dioxide levels had risen to 340 parts per million. The fossil fuel industry and several other industries and right-wing philanthropic organizations would continue to oppose climate change for several decades in the future. In the middle 1970s and 1980s, funded research on climate science boomed. By the late 1980s, the international community was convinced that the world needed a global solution to climate change. As a result, negotiations began in the late 1980s, which led to the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which the United States, according to its lead negotiator, William Nitze, single-handedly weakened by preventing the international community from agreeing to enforceable emissions reduction targets for developed countries. By 1995, the science supporting concerns about climate change had become so strong, the international community agreed that it needed to negotiate an amendment to the United Nations Treaty, and has thus finally negotiated in 1997 the Kyoto Protocol, which for the first time had enforceable targets for developed countries. The United States, however, never ratified that treaty. It had been pushed by the fossil fuel industry in the United States not to do so. By the time the treaty, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, CO2 had risen to 363 parts per million. When President George Bush II became president in 2001, he soon announced the U.S. was withdrawing from any participation in the Kyoto Protocol, making the U.S. the only developed country without an enforceable greenhouse gas reduction target. George Bush had been pushed by the fossil fuel industry and others opposed to climate action. At the time that he did it, CO2 levels had risen to 371 parts per million. The period from 2000 to 2011 in the U.S. Congress was marked by one failure after the other to adopt meaningful climate change legislation. Opposition from the fossil fuel industry and the well-organized disinformation campaign prevented meaningful legislation. In the meantime, carbon dioxide had risen to 390 parts per million. And so for over 3 decades, the fossil fuel industry and other industries that wanted to use fossil fuel at the lowest possible cost had convinced many U.S. politicians and many U.S. citizens that the science of climate change did not support action. However, the most prestigious scientific organizations had continued to conclude something quite different from this, starting in 1978, when the U.S. Academy of Science reviewed the science and concluded that human-induced climate change was a significant threat to human health and global ecological systems. Because the United States had resisted making commitments to reduce its emissions using the excuse that the science of climate change was too uncertain, the international community created, at the suggestion of the United States, the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose mission was to review the peer-reviewed scientific literature and make recommendations based upon that to governments about what to do about climate change. In 1990, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued its first report, which concluded that climate change was a significant threat and action should be taken. In 1995, IPCC issued its second report, which confirmed and strengthened its conclusions in the first report. In 2001, the U.S. Academy of Science issued another report, reviewed the IPCC work, and concluded that it was entitled to scientific respect. In 2001, IPCC issued its third report, which concluded that human activities were threatening human health and global ecological systems. Each IPCC report strengthened, confirmed the conclusions of prior reports based upon the new information that came in the intervening years. In 2007, IPCC issued its fourth report, which concluded with high levels of confidence that climate change was a huge threat to people around the world and global ecological systems. And it added, with even higher confidence, that the warming, which was now undisputable and visible, was human-caused, and they made this conclusion with 95% confidence levels. And so the IPCC reached strong conclusions about climate change in 2011, the United States Academy of Science issued yet another report on the science of climate change, confirming all its prior reports, supporting the conclusions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which had concluded that human-induced climate change is a huge and growing threat to the human race and ecological systems. Every prestigious scientific organization has thus taken a position in support of the consensus view. Yet the climate change disinformation campaign has been engaged in reckless disregard for the truth. This is not responsible skepticism, but perhaps a new kind of crime against humanity. The scientific community has concluded that we are running out of time to prevent really dangerous, rapid, nonlinear climate change. This chart on the right-hand side illustrates the complex scientific basis for this. Time doesn't allow to get into this in much detail. The darker the red in the arrows, the higher the probability that the world will experience rapid, non-linear climate change in the categories listed on the left-hand side of the chart, such as air and water, etc. This chart can be read to show that above 2 degrees centigrade, the higher the probability is that the world will experience rapid, non-linear climate change. And so, the international community has agreed that it would be very foolish not to try to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade. This chart also demonstrates why the international community is so worried about greenhouse gas levels that we're already experiencing in the atmosphere. The different colored lines show emissions reductions pathways necessary to stabilize CO2 at various levels. The yellow line is the 550 line, the red line is 450 parts per million. Yet, the chart also indicates that even if we could stabilize at 450 parts per million, there's a 45 to 88% chance that we're going to see the 2 degrees centigrade. The international community is really worried because we're running out of time to prevent rapid, nonlinear climate impacts. There is now a growing sociological peer-reviewed literature which explains the climate change disinformation campaign, what it is, how it's been funded, how it operates. This chart is by two sociologists, Dunlap and McCreet. It depicts how the disinformation campaign has worked. Across the top are the funders, the fossil fuel industry, the other corporations and right-wing philanthropic organizations that have funded think tanks, front groups, all of which talk to each other over the internet and spread misinformation about the mainstream science in a way that has been quite effective in the United States. Now, of course, skepticism in science is a good thing. It should be encouraged. It should be encouraged about climate change science. However, the tactics of the disinformation campaign cannot be understood to be responsible, reasonable scientific skepticism. This chart identifies some of the tactics which are identified in the sociological literature. They include reckless disregard for the truth, ignoring the knowns, and focusing on unknowns, specious claims about bad science, the use of front groups, think tanks, PR campaigns, manufacturing bogus science, the creation of bogus economic arguments, and most troubling, cyberbullying journalists and scientists. This is not reasonable skepticism. This is ethically abhorrent disinformation. So a well-financed, well-organized disinformation campaign has convinced Americans and politicians that the science of climate change is not entitled to respect, despite the fact that every scientific organization with relevant expertise has concluded differently. This chart shows that while this was happening, atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases are actually exceeding worst-case predictions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so the disinformation campaign has created extremely dangerous conditions for the human community. And so a climate change disinformation campaign and their lobbyists have created a situation which is putting hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people at great risk of catastrophic climate impacts of various types, including droughts, floods, loss of food, rising sea levels, increases in certain kinds of diseases. Clearly, this is a morally reprehensible behavior. In fact, perhaps we should be talking about this as some kind of new crime against humanity. We began this video by noting that when President Lyndon Johnson warned the American people about the impending dangers of climate change, carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration was 320 parts per million. Now it's 395.7 parts per million and rising at 1 to 2% per year. Clearly, the climate change disinformation campaign has helped create a very dangerous global situation that threatens the poorest people around the world. We must understand their tactics in light of what's at stake, morally reprehensible disinformation. In fact, arguably, it's some kind of new crime against humanity, and perhaps we should be talking about it in these terms.